A regular Tuesday afternoon at Fresh Market, where the gentle hum of shopping carts and casual chatter fills the air. Among the bustling aisles, a distinguished gentleman in a tailored charcoal suit carefully selects premium coffee beans, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light. Just a few feet away, an elderly man in a worn cardigan sweater taps his white cane against the shelves, his uncertain movements drawing concerned glances from other shoppers. Life has a peculiar way of bringing people together, doesn't it? Sometimes, the most meaningful connections happen in the most ordinary places. That's exactly what was about to unfold in this neighborhood grocery store, where two men from seemingly different worlds were about to cross paths. The well-dressed businessman had just closed a major real estate deal downtown. His Tesla was parked outside, and he could have easily rushed home to celebrate. Instead, something made him pause when he noticed the elderly man struggling to find his items, the shopping list clutched tightly in his trembling hands. What happened next challenged every stereotype, every preconceived notion that society often holds. The businessman approached with genuine warmth, his voice gentle as he offered assistance. The blind man's initial hesitation melted away as they began talking, sharing stories while navigating the aisles together. But this isn't just another feel-good story about a random act of kindness. As they moved through the store, picking out ripe tomatoes and fresh bread, their conversation revealed layers of unexpected connections. The blind man, a retired music teacher, had spent decades teaching inner-city kids the power of classical music. The businessman, it turned out, had been one of those kids who found their passion in a similar program years ago. Their shopping cart journey became a bridge between two different lives, two different experiences, two different perspectives. Other customers watched in curiosity as these unlikely shopping partners laughed together, the businessman describing the colors of fresh produce with poetic detail, the blind man sharing wisdom about choosing the ripest fruits by touch alone. What started as a simple offer to help turned into something much more profound. But here's where things get interesting. Neither man was quite who they appeared to be at first glance. As they approached the checkout counter, a revelation was about to unfold that would challenge everything we think we know about judgments, assumptions, and the stories we tell ourselves about strangers. The security cameras captured every moment of their interaction, but they caught something else too, something that would soon make this grocery store encounter go viral for reasons nobody could have predicted. The businessman's gesture of kindness was about to unveil a truth that would leave millions of viewers questioning their own biases and assumptions. As they reached for the same bunch of bananas, the blind man's hand brushed against the businessman's watch. His fingers traced the distinctive pattern on its face, and his expression changed. He had felt this exact watch before, somewhere else, in another time, in another place. The businessman noticed the sudden change in his companion's demeanor, and for a moment, both men stood frozen in the produce section, the weight of an unspoken recognition hanging between them. What happened next would challenge everything we think we know about coincidence, fate, and the invisible threads that connect our lives. But before we reveal the twist that made this simple grocery store encounter go viral, let's remember that sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what we can see on the surface, but about what lies beneath our quick judgments and assumptions. Stay tuned for what happens next, because this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming, not even the two men standing in that grocery store on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The businessman's voice softened as he noticed the change in his companion's expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked, still holding the bunch of bananas between them. The blind man's fingers continued to trace the watch's surface, his clouded eyes filling with tears. "This watch," he whispered, "I've only felt one other like it in my 40 years of teaching." The bustling grocery store seemed to fade away as both men stood there, surrounded by the mundane display of fruits and vegetables. The businessman's usual confident demeanor wavered slightly, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity and growing recognition. Other shoppers moved around them, oblivious to the profound moment unfolding in their midst. 25 years ago, in a small music classroom on the south side of the city, a young boy would stay after school every Tuesday and Thursday. His family couldn't afford a piano, but his music teacher would let him practice on the old upright in the corner. The boy had raw talent, but more importantly, He had determination. His teacher noticed how the child's eyes would light up when he played, how his fingers would dance across the keys with natural grace. One day, that same teacher had shown the boy his prized possession, a distinctive watch passed down through his family for generations. He had let the young student hold it, feel its unique engravings, and told him about its history. This watch, he had said, represents more than time. It represents legacy, persistence, and the power of believing in yourself. Now standing in the grocery store, the businessman's mind raced back to those after-school sessions, to the mentor who had believed in him long before he believed in himself. But how could this be the same watch? His old teacher had moved away years ago, and he had lost touch despite his best efforts to find him. The blind man's hands trembled as he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I gave away this exact type of watch once to a student who showed me that music could bridge any divide. He was a boy who, his voice trailed off, lost in the memory of a classroom from decades past. Around them, the store continued its normal rhythm, the beeping of checkout counters, the squeaking of shopping cart wheels, the distant sound of the store's playlist playing forgotten hits from another era. But for these two men, time seemed to stand still, suspended in a moment of possibility and revelation. The businessman's phone buzzed in his pocket, probably another important client, another deal waiting to be closed. But for the first time in years, he let it ring. Some moments deserve our full attention, our complete presence. This was one of them. As they stood there, other shoppers began to notice. A young mother with her child stopped to watch. An elderly couple paused their shopping. Something about these two men's expressions, their posture, the tangible emotion between them, drew others in. In a world where everyone is usually rushing to their next destination, this moment of genuine human connection stood out like a beacon. But before either man could say what was on the tip of their tongues, before they could confirm what both were beginning to suspect, a commotion at the front of the store drew everyone's attention. The automatic doors slid open with a bang, and a group of people rushed in, their urgent voices cutting through the store's peaceful atmosphere. What happened next would not only change both men's lives forever, but would also challenge everything we think we know about coincidence, fate, and the power of music to connect souls across time and circumstance. But first, we need to understand exactly what brought these two men to this precise moment, in this exact store, on this particular day. The commotion at the front of the store turned out to be a local news crew, rushing in to cover what they thought was a routine human interest story. Someone had called them about a wealthy businessman helping a blind man with his shopping, a simple act of kindness that would normally warrant a feel-good segment on the evening news, but they were about to witness something far more extraordinary. As the news crew approached with their cameras, the blind man's expression changed from emotional recognition to sudden concern. His grip tightened on his white cane, and he took a small step backward. The businessman noticed this subtle shift and instinctively moved closer, as if to shield his companion from the approaching media attention. I didn't know anyone was filming, the blind man said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of distress. There's something you need to know, something I've been trying to tell many people for years, but nobody would listen. The businessman's heart raced as he began to piece together fragments of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. The store manager appeared, attempting to manage the situation as more customers gathered around. The news crew's presence had created an impromptu audience, all watching this unscripted moment unfold between two strangers who perhaps weren't strangers at all. That music program where I taught, the blind man continued, his voice growing stronger. It wasn't just about teaching notes and scales. We were protecting something precious. He reached into his worn cardigan's pocket and pulled out an old, folded newspaper clipping. Despite his blindness, he knew exactly where it was, as if he carried it close to his heart for years. The businessman gently took the yellowed paper, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The headline dated back 25 years. Local music program saves historic community center from demolition. But it was the photograph beneath the headline that made his breath catch in his throat. There in grainy black and white stood a younger version of his blind companion, still sighted then, surrounded by students at a piano. And there, in the corner of the photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was a young boy wearing a watch, the same distinctive watch that now adorned the businessman's wrist. The news crew had gone quiet, their cameras rolling, capturing every nuance of this unexpected reunion. But there was more to this story than a simple teacher-student reconnection. The businessmen remembered something else from those days, something about a hidden document, a truth that could change the fate of their old neighborhood even now. The watch, the blind man said urgently, it was never just a watch, was it? His clouded eyes seemed to look straight through to the businessman's soul. Inside the case, there's an inscription. Have you ever read it? The businessman's fingers moved to his wrist, touching the watch he'd worn every day since his success in real estate. In all these years, he'd never thought to look inside the case. As he began to unfasten it, his hands shaking slightly, a security guard approached with an urgent message. The guard whispered something in the businessman's ear that made him freeze. Outside the store, a group of developers had arrived, the same ones who had been pressuring the old neighborhood to sell, the same ones who had been mysteriously connected to the attempted demolition of the community center all those years ago. The blind man sensed the tension in the air. "They're here, aren't they?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "After all these years, they're still trying to erase our history." The businessman looked at his old teacher, then at the watch, then at the growing crowd of onlookers. Whatever was inscribed inside that watch case could change everything. But did he dare reveal it here, now, in front of all these witnesses? The automatic doors slid open again. The developers strode in, their expensive suits and confident smirks a stark contrast to the authentic emotion hanging in the air. The moment of truth had arrived, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen next. As the developers approached, the businessman's fingers finally opened the watch case. Inside, rather than a simple inscription, he found a small, intricately folded piece of paper, preserved perfectly over the decades. The blind man smiled knowingly, almost as if he could see the revelation unfolding. "Some things," he said softly, "are worth protecting for 25 years. The lead developer, a stern-faced woman in a crisp navy suit, stopped abruptly when she recognized the businessman. "Michael," she said, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes, "I didn't expect to find you here, especially with—" Her voice trailed off as she glanced at the blind man, a flicker of recognition and worry crossing her face. The news crew, sensing the growing tension, moved closer. Their cameras captured the moment the businessman carefully unfolded the paper from inside the watch. His hands trembled as he realized what he was holding, the original deed to the community center, with signatures and addendums that proved what they had suspected all those years ago. "You knew," the businessman said, looking at his former teacher. "You knew they had falsified the demolition papers back then. That's why you gave me the watch." The blind man nodded, his clouded eyes brimming with tears. "I needed to protect both the evidence and you. They had already threatened my family, and then my accident happened." The developer took a step forward, her composure cracking slightly. "Whatever you think you have there is irrelevant. The statute of limitations." But before she could finish, another voice cut through the tension. An elderly woman emerged from the growing crowd of shoppers, her phone held high, playing a video. "I was on the community center board," she announced, her voice strong despite her age. The video showed younger versions of both the blind teacher and the developer, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument outside the music room. "I recorded everything that day, including the threats made to our music teacher. I've been waiting for the right moment, for someone brave enough to come forward." The store had gone completely silent. Even the usual background music had stopped, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The businessman looked down at the deed in his hands, then at his watch, understanding finally dawning on his face. The music program hadn't just been about teaching children to play piano. It had been a cover for gathering evidence, for protecting the heart of their community. But the developers weren't finished. The stern-faced woman pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "You might want to check the current property values before you do anything rash," she said, her voice carrying a veiled threat. "Your real estate empire is quite impressive. It would be a shame if certain investments suddenly collapsed. The blind man stepped forward, his cane tapping purposefully on the linoleum floor. "There's something else you should know," he said, reaching into his pocket once more. "Something about why I really came to this particular store today, at this particular time." He pulled out another piece of paper, this one crisp and new. The businessman watched as his former teacher handed the paper to the news crew. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the letterhead. It was from the State Historical Society, dated just that morning. But before anyone could read its contents, the store's lights suddenly went out, plunging everyone into darkness. In the chaos that followed, multiple voices called out, shopping carts clattered, and somewhere in the darkness, someone had grabbed both the deed and the Historical Society letter. When the emergency lights flickered on 30 seconds later, the documents were gone, but so was the developer's confident smirk. For in those brief moments of darkness, something had changed. The blind man stood calmly, a slight smile playing on his lips, while the businessman reached for his phone, quickly dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "It's time," he said into the phone. "Plan B is in motion." The news crew's cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of what was about to become the story of the decade, because sometimes the greatest acts of justice aren't served in courtrooms. They're served in grocery store aisles between cans of soup and bags of rice, where the past and present collide in ways nobody could have predicted. In the tense moments that followed, the emergency lights cast long shadows across the store aisles. The businessman's Plan B revealed itself as dozens of community members began streaming through the grocery store doors. Each person carried a folder, and each folder contained copies, hundreds of copies of every document that had just disappeared in the darkness. The blind teacher's smile widened. "You didn't think I'd protect those documents for 25 years without making backups, did you?" His voice carried a strength that seemed to fill the entire store. "Every music student who graduated from our program took home a copy. We called it their graduation certificate." The developer's face drained of color as she watched community members approach the news crew, handing over their folders. Parents, teachers, former students, faces from the past emerged from the crowd, each with their own story, their own piece of the puzzle. The businessman realized that his old teacher hadn't just taught music. He had built an army of witnesses. "You see," the blind man continued, his voice steady, "the Historical Society letter wasn't just about preserving a building. It was about preserving evidence." He turned towards the sound of the developer's nervous breathing. "They've reopened the investigation into the accident that took my site. Interesting timing, isn't it?" The businessman stepped forward, finally understanding his role in this decades-long plan. His real estate success hadn't been just about making money. It had been about gaining access, about understanding the very system that had once threatened his community. He had built his empire while watching, waiting, and protecting the truth. Suddenly, another figure stepped out from behind the store's customer service desk, a federal agent who had been posing as a cashier. "We've been monitoring this situation for months," she announced, displaying her badge. "The Historical Society letter was just a catalyst to bring everyone together. We needed all the players in one place." The developer lunged for her phone, but the businessman was faster. He held up his own phone, showing a live stream of the entire scene being broadcast across multiple social media platforms. "The darkness was never about stealing documents," he said quietly. "It was about proving who would try to steal them." The blind teacher reached out, finding his former student's shoulder with perfect accuracy. "Music teaches us patience," he said, his voice carrying years of wisdom. "Sometimes you have to wait for exactly the right moment, the perfect crescendo." As the federal agents began reading rights and conducting arrests, the businessman noticed something else. The watch's case had a false bottom. Inside, he found a small key with a familiar musical note engraved on it. His teacher smiled, sensing his discovery. "There's a piano in the community center's basement," he explained. "Behind it is a room full of original documents, recordings, and evidence that will help rebuild not just our neighborhood, but dozens of others across the city." The news crew captured everything. The arrests, the tears, the hugs, and the moment the businessman realized that his success had been orchestrated by his teacher all along, preparing him for this very day. But as the excitement began to settle, the blind teacher had one final revelation. "There's something else you should know," he said, reaching for his dark glasses. As he removed them, everyone gasped. His eyes, though still damaged, showed signs of recent surgery. "The accident that took my sight, it wasn't completely successful. Modern medicine has been making progress, and I've been receiving experimental treatments. I can now see shadows, light, and soon, maybe more." The businessman looked at his mentor with tears in his eyes. "You could see enough to recognize me today, couldn't you?" The teacher nodded, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "I recognize your kindness," he replied, "just as I did 25 years ago. Sometimes the most important things can't be seen with eyes at all." As the story reached national news that evening, viewers were captivated not just by the exposure of corruption, but by the incredible tale of patience, teaching, and justice served in the most unexpected way, through a simple act of kindness in a grocery store aisle, planned meticulously over 25 years by a teacher who never stopped believing in the power of music, truth, and the human spirit. In the days that followed, the old community center buzzed with activity. The basement piano room, unlocked with the watch's hidden key, revealed boxes of meticulously organized evidence that led to more arrests and the reversal of dozens of fraudulent property deals across the city. But more importantly, it also contained something else. Hundreds of recordings of students playing piano, each one marked with a date and a dream. The businessman spent evenings listening to these recordings, including his own from 25 years ago. Each tape captured not just music, but moments of mentorship, whispered encouragements, and the sound of his teacher believing in every student who walked through those doors. He found himself particularly moved by one recording where his younger self struggled with a difficult piece, and his teacher's patient voice guided him through. The community center underwent renovation, funded in part by the businessman's foundation. But unlike modern development projects, this renovation preserved every brick, every creaky floorboard, and especially the old upright piano that had witnessed so many lessons. The music program resumed, with the blind teacher, now able to see enough to navigate the familiar halls, returning to teach a new generation. 1 month after the grocery store incident, during the community center's reopening ceremony, something remarkable happened. The businessman sat at the old piano, adjusted his father's watch on his wrist, and began to play. The piece was the same one he had struggled with as a child, but this time his fingers moved confidently across the keys. His teacher stood nearby, tears in his partially restored eyes, watching the shadows of his former students' hands dance across the keys. "You know," the teacher said to the gathered crowd, "people keep asking me why I chose a grocery store for our final meeting. Why not the community center itself?" He smiled, gesturing toward the businessman at the piano. "Because true change doesn't happen in places where you expect it. It happens in ordinary moments, when someone chooses to help another person simply because they can." The story made national headlines not just for exposing corruption, but for demonstrating how patience, teaching, and kindness could work together to create justice. The developer and her associates faced federal charges, while other communities across the country began investigating similar cases of fraudulent property deals. But perhaps the most lasting impact came from an unexpected source. The security camera footage of that day in the grocery store, showing a wealthy man helping a blind stranger with his shopping, went viral for an entirely different reason. Viewers were moved by the genuine interaction that preceded the dramatic revelations, the simple act of humanity that started it all. The businessman continued his real estate work, but with a new focus. His company became known for preserving historical properties and protecting community spaces. The watch, now a symbol of their shared victory, remained on his wrist, though he checked the case regularly for new messages, smiling at his teacher's penchant for dramatic reveals. As for the blind teacher, his vision continued to improve gradually with treatment. He often joked that he had seen enough darkness in the world and was ready to focus on the light. His music program expanded, now incorporating lessons about community activism, historical preservation, and the power of patient resistance. Years later, customers at that same grocery store would sometimes pause in the produce section, reading a small plaque that marked the spot where it all happened. Sometimes it read, "The greatest symphonies of justice begin with a simple act of kindness." And if you visit the community center today, you might hear piano music drifting from an open window. You might see students carrying folders of sheet music, unaware that their graduation certificates now include a new document, the story of how a teacher, a student, and an old watch came together to prove that the most powerful changes in our world often start with someone simply choosing to help another person reach for a can of soup on a high shelf.